Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. Okay, wonderful. To this space of discussion about the Mediterranean, I'll bring my little contribution about the geopolitics today of the Mediterranean. So it's something very specific because we had many historical comments which are very interesting, and I will say something about history as well, but very rapidly because it's not my field of specialty. I prefer to discuss about the current affairs. So I'm ready to discuss everything about the current affairs, not about history. If there are some little mistakes, I say that there is something different from what Molly said, for example, but I will not insist about that because it's not my field, so I will not argue with you. You know 1,000 times more than me, so I don't. Of course, since my specialty is geopolitics of regions, and I'm coming from Paris, probably you would expect something about what happened yesterday, but I'm sorry to disappoint you. If we start discussing about that, we cannot discuss about anything else. So I keep going on my path, and if you want, we can discuss later about that. So as I told you, this is the picture I wanted to give you about the geopolitical situation today, in particular the fact that there is no a single power which is able to claim absolute and exclusive authority on the Mediterranean. Today, the Mediterranean is very crowded, more crowded than ever, and less strategic than ever. So there is an apparent contradiction in the two terms. Of course, and this is part of what you said this morning, in the past it happened several times that the Mediterranean was the Mare Nostrum of someone. And here I prepared a very, very short list of what happened in the past time. As I told you, I don't insist very much. We don't have so much time about the past, and of course this is something you know much better than me. And you know, of course, that the geopolitical relevance of Mediterranean changed during the centuries, because for a long time, and this is something I always explain to my students when I explain Europe, for example. What is Europe? Europe, it's in historical term, a recent political creation. For a long time, the real continent was the Mediterranean. And I was happy yesterday to hear my colleague Bernardo saying that we can also speak about Indian Mediterranean continent, because actually we have to expand this idea of the continent. And this morning as well, we heard more or less the same thing. What is important in the past, and even in the more recent past, is that sometimes the control of the internal lake, the Mediterranean, meant the control of an important part of the world. And in the case of Britain and the United States, the control of the Mediterranean went along with the control of the entire world. It was a part of the control of the entire world. Insisting of the change of geopolitical relevance of Mediterranean, we can also notice something interesting from a purely geographical point of view, because of course we know that geopolitically speaking, Mediterranean was important because it was the main road from Europe to Asia, and still is, of course. But there is something more. For example, the role of Libya and Sicily for the Roman Empire is no longer the same. I mean, of course, it's no longer the same, but for the Roman Empire, Libya and Sicily were the wheat belt of the empire. And it's very difficult, again, when I teach that to my students, for them it's surprising to imagine Sicily and Libya as the wheat belt of the Roman Empire. So even geographical conditions changed, not only geopolitical conditions. In any case, For Britain, we had an indirect interest in Mediterranean, because Mediterranean was the gate to India, and the control of Mediterranean permitted the control of India, so the jewel of the crown, which was the most important part of the Mediterranean. What happened? Professor Troiani just told us about the United States, so I don't want to insist very much, but it's maybe, since here there are many Italians, important to remember that the United States arrived into the Mediterranean brought by Italians, and indirectly, because the catastrophe, the military catastrophe of Italians during World War II brought Germans into the Mediterranean, and consequently brought Americans to the Mediterranean. Whatever the reason, in any case, what happened next after World War II is that, with the help of the Soviet Union, the United States got rid the Mediterranean of the ancient colonial powers. It was a process that which started with the war, and we can say finished in 1962 with the independence of Algeria. In all these operations, the United States operated with heavy hand, and always on the same side of the Soviet Union. This is something we cannot and we should not forget. But of course it didn't mean that the United States and the Soviet Union were allied, because at the same time the United States did whatever it could in order to keep the Soviet Union away from the Mediterranean. So using Turkey as the main bulwark against the Soviet Union. So what happened is that the United States made the Mediterranean Sea one of the keystones of its control of Europe, and one of the keystones of its control of the Middle East, when the United States was controlling the entire world, which was a short period of the history, but a long period of the history of the 20th century. So now we have to talk about what is going on today. And when we move from the past to the present, we have to consider that problem, that issue. And the issue is the American relative decline. The issue has been described very well in a book published in 1987, so it means that the problem existed already and it was analyzed already very well by Paul Kennedy in his book The Rise and Fall of the Great Powers. I don't want to summarize the book, of course, because I assume that you know it, but the central point is this sentence about the Imperial Overstretch. In 1987, Paul Kennedy said what might roughly be called Imperial Overstretch, that is to say, decision makers in Washington must face the awkward and enduring fact that the sum total of the United States global interests and obligations is nowadays, 1987, far larger than the country's power to defend them all simultaneously. This is 1987. In 2008, the National Intelligence Council of the United States published this document. You know, this document is published every 4 years when a new president is elected. So it's a kind of a guideline for the new president. It was published before the election. And at the end of this document is a more or less 100-page document, and say, owing the relative decline of its economic and to a lesser extent military power, the US will no longer have the same flexibility in choosing among as many policy options, which is exactly what Kennedy had already said in 20 years before. So we can say that Obama's geopolitical retrenchment, we are not here to start wars, but we are here to finish wars, is more an obligation than a choice. The United States cannot longer do the same policies, has no longer the space to do the policies that he did during the previous years. So it means that when you have to reorganize your forces, you have to concentrate, to restructure and concentrate your forces. And one effect of this, a visible effect of this restructuration is that the Gulf is much more, strategically much more important than the Mediterranean. I agree when you say that there is a continuum between Mediterranean and the Gulf, but if you look at the map of the global expansion of the US military involvement, you see, and it's by ages, I don't know if you can see the ages, but this is starting in at the beginning of the 20th century and finishing after 2000. And the main concentration is in the Gulf, so it's moving from the Mediterranean toward the Gulf. The more red, the redder, I don't know if you say the redder, the more recent. In brief, for the United States, of course, the Mediterranean has never been the gate to India. So it's a big difference between the role of the United States and the role of the United Kingdom in the Mediterranean. But today, the Mediterranean is no longer the bulwark against Russia, because Russia is no longer the power it was. We will say something about Russia. It was during the Cold War. The Mediterranean is no longer the way to oil for the United States, because, as you know, the United States imports much more oil from Canada and imports much more oil from South America than from the Middle East. So Middle East was, at the wake of 2003 invasion, was 20% of the importation of oil of the United States. So when you hear that was a war for oil, it's wrong. It was not a war for oil, or at least not a war for oil for the United States, for the needs of the United States. Maybe a war for oil for the needs of China, for the needs of Japan, for the needs of Far Eastern countries, but not for the United States. The United States didn't go to Iraq because they wanted to conquer oil. But okay, this is another thing. We cannot talk about the Gulf, we cannot talk about Iraq, because, as I told you, it's too big. In the maps, I'll leave you this presentation if you want, because the maps are very precise about the part of importation of oils in different states of the United States. But let's go on, because we have the decline of the United States on one side, and on the other side we have a decline of the Mediterranean itself, because the Mediterranean has lost part of its geopolitical value because of many problems inside, and many of them are have already been listed today. So I don't insist specifically in any of them, because we know them very well. Just one thing about the demographic imbalance. In a book published in France about the demography, there was an interesting consideration about the role of Mediterranean, because the Mediterranean is the border between the least demographic dynamic continent, which is Europe, and the most dynamic demographic continent, which is Africa. But as you can see from this map, the problem is not Northern Africa. The problem is Sub-Saharan Africa in demographic terms. I was surprised to notice that Tunisia, for example, has today lower rates of birth than France. And Algeria is approaching. So we can say, even from the colors, this is a CIA World Fact with 2015, even the colors say pretty well what is the real situation. Italy is much weaker demographically speaking than Tunisia and Algeria, and France is much stronger than Tunisia. So let's go on on this and come back to this, the situation. I would say something about the single powers involved in the Mediterranean. So we need to understand why the Mediterranean is so crowded and what the single powers are doing. So first of all, it's crowded because there is a vacuum. As we say, policy is, as Professor Troiani said right now, politics are horror vacui, cannot support the void. Any void created in politics has to be filled immediately. So if the United States retreats, if the Soviet Union retreats, these voids are filled immediately. But let's first of all eliminated the powers, small and medium powers that don't have a direct interest in this scramble for the Mediterranean, because they are not strong enough, or because they don't have the interest. And let's talk about the other ones very rapidly, because I have a list of the powers could be interested in the Mediterranean. Here in this page I listed the powers which are not prevalently interested in Mediterranean. Turkey, because it was never an essentially maritime power. I know that there is something we could discuss, but in geopolitical terms, at least what I studied, is that the main geopolitical interest of the Ottoman Empire lied in the Danube Basin and in the Anatolian Peninsula, and occasionally in Mesopotamia. So it's much more a land power than a sea power. Germany, as I told you presently, was dragged into the Mediterranean by the Italian catastrophe in World War II. Of course, they tried to prevent the Italian defeat, but it wasn't successful. But the main geopolitical interest of Germany still lies in Eastern Europe and occasionally in the Balkans, when we are talking of the greater Germany, Germany and Austria. So Europe, the European Union as such, cannot be said having a direct interest in the Mediterranean, because in the European Union still coexist different and mutually exclusive geopolitical goals. France has not the same goals than Germany, Britain has not the same goal than Germany and France, and so on. Let's go back rapidly to the United States. As I told you, the Mediterranean is no longer a strategic priority for the United States, but the United States will do whatever it takes to stay in Mediterranean. First of all, because it's a global power, and a global power wants to keep its presence everywhere it can. The second reason is that the United States is in the Mediterranean because it wants to be able to intervene rapidly in the Middle East if necessary. The third is that it wants to deter possible competitors, not only Russia, but European powers, China, and so on. Fourth is to feed the divisions among European powers. I just say something about the division about European powers. So it's very easy, and the United States systematically do that. I mean, I don't express any judgment when I say that. I am not proposing solutions, I just giving you analysis. So the United States is regularly trying to put disorder and divisions among European powers, among Russia and Europe, and so on and so on. And fifth reason, the United States is there to be able to play its own African policies. They are not very important, but they exist, and the position in the Mediterranean can help. What about Russia? Of course, we should say something about the main geopolitical problem of Russia, which is the lack of year-round access to navigable waters, which makes Russia essentially a land power, even though if you have a look at the geographical map, you see it's surrounded by seas, but they are not navigable. So it's a landlocked. It's an historical problem, not the only one, but it's decisive. So Russia, the entire history of Russia is the history of expansion toward the seas. And if you have a look at the map of Russia today, and you compare of the map of Russia during the war, during the Cold War, but let's go back here a moment. You see that today Russia cannot expand toward the Pacific Sea because it should have immediate problems not with Japan but with China in Manchuria. Cannot expand toward the Indian Ocean, which was the line of expansion for the entire 19th century until the, well, let's say, the occupation of Afghanistan in 1979, when they arrived very, very close to the Indian Ocean. And today, as you can see, with the independence of the Central Asian republics, Russia is very, very far from Indian Ocean. So the only way left is the Mediterranean. And it can help explain what happened in Ukraine, in Crimea. The control of Black Sea is an important element to control the Mediterranean, and it's very important to explain what Putin is doing today in Syria. The other, the map of the Cold War is interesting because in pink with the red star, we have the countries which were allied with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, and it means that the position of Russia at the time was much more favorable because it had a lot of allies in the Mediterranean area, which is no longer the case, and which explains why Putin insisted so much about his alliance with Syria and not particularly with Bashar al-Assad, because I'm sure that if Russia could find its interest in dumping Assad, it will do tonight, not tomorrow. What about France? This is another very interesting aspect, which is not very often considered in international relations, but we can say that there is a constant in French history is that France went to the Mediterranean whenever it was jammed in Europe. Whenever it had problems with neighbors in Europe, France chose the Mediterranean, chose or was pushed toward the Mediterranean. It started in 1536 with the historical alliance, we say something, between between Francis I and the Ottoman Empire. It was, by the way, the longest foreign alliance of France ever, because it started in 1536 and it lasted until the arrival of Napoleon in Egypt, the longest in the history of France. And it was another characteristic of the 19th century, because France went to Algeria after the defeat of Napoleon. It was the first success, let's say that, of France after the defeat of Napoleon. And the same in Tunisia in 1881, when it was pushed by Germany to conquer Tunisia in order to make up the situation, the defeat in Europe and the loss of Alsace-Lorraine for Germany. You mentioned the European Union for the Mediterranean. which was an initiative launched by Sarkozy, prepared by Chirac, I would say, but launched by Sarkozy, and it was stopped by Germany. So when Germany moved this initiative, which was the Union for the Mediterranean, you see the countries in the map above, and it became no, it was a Mediterranean Union first, and it became a Union for the Mediterranean, which lost completely its significance. And what happened next? After this failure, France launched several unilateral military interventions in Africa. Unilateral means that they were not, this operation, the military operation, were not done in accord with Germany. Germany disagreed deeply with these initiatives. In Libya, first one, in Mali, in the Central African Republic, and France tried to launch another initiative in Syria with the United States more recently. And today, after the Iranian nuclear agreement, France is trying to play Egyptian, Saudi, and Qatari cards. So we can say that today, when France is no longer the leading power of the European Union, the Mediterranean card is left the only geopolitical card of France. Of course, there will be the European card as well, but France is no longer ready to. Okay, how long I have to? Couple of minutes. So we don't say anything about Italy because it's not important. We say something about China because China was made a naval drill joined with Russia in May this year. It was the first time that Russia and China had naval exercises in the Mediterranean together. China wants to be in the Mediterranean because it's a global power, wants to be a global power, even though, of course, it's not insisting very much. This is something important. I would like to say something rapidly, because as you said, the problem, we have some countries which are not Mediterranean, you can say, but their reciprocal fights have the consequences in the Mediterranean. I mean a reciprocal fight between Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and Iran. And what about Turkey and Israel? Turkey and Israel are not interested either to play a game in Mediterranean game, but they don't want Saudi Arabia, Iran, and Qatar being Mediterranean powers. So they will do whatever they can in order to prevent this power to become Mediterranean powers. Even Serbia is not very important, but it's interesting to see that Serbia tried to have this access to the sea, and it was almost always unsuccessful. So we have to keep in mind that Serbia is one of the, even though we are talking only of the Adriatic Sea and on the entire Mediterranean Sea, but in any case we have to keep it in mind. This is an interesting postal card I found, Souvenir du premier port serbe. Memories from the first Serbian port. It was Durrës in Albania. So it's why Austria and Italy decided to create Albania, just to push Serbia away from the Mediterranean.
Manlio, you have 30 seconds to tell us about Italy, because actually we have now left only...
No, about Italy is very shortly. It's the same situation of France, but without being a former great power, without being a formal winner of World War II. So for Italy, Italy tried to play the Mediterranean card. It still tried to play the Mediterranean card, but it has not. It's not strong enough to do it by itself. Okay, here you have the conclusion, and I don't steal you more time. Thank you very much.